We do practice forms of slavery today that would be categorized as slavery in the Bible. And we're playing an elaborate game of hide the ball and then handing atheists this sort of like trump card over Christianity. And also, I think what's even more devastating is how it destroys Christians' trust in scripture. That's the move that I'm primarily writing to address. So it's really, really important for anyone listening to this to understand how incredibly wise the Torah is. Not just the New Testament, the Torah. That's why I'm
Yep.
really trying to defend the Torah. The first five books of the Bible, the legislation that's given to us in the Torah is unbelievably nuanced. And there are lots of things in there that are difficult for modern people to hear, but you really have to do your research. You really have to study and understand the context and understand really what it's describing. And there are so many ethically incredibly superior ideas for how to help people get out of slavery. Things like the year of Jubilee was on an amazing idea to that every single debt would be canceled across. Like the Torah did so much to try to end the practice of sort of debt-based slavery within the Hebrew community. And we've never, ever figured that out. Like the whole reason why most people came, Europeans came across the ocean was because if you let just the typical economy run in any society, eventually within a few centuries, you'll have 1% of the people owning 99% of the resources. They'll just pass it on to their kids, and then that'll be a self-perpetuating cycle. And eventually you'll have this massive underclass of poor people. And this is what happened in Europe. So people were flooding across the ocean to immigrate to the United States in order to avoid the kind of servitude that was exacted on them because of the aristocracy that owned all the land. That couldn't happen in the way the Torah was designed. The Torah basically ensured that every single family got a plot of land. And if a father got into some kind of debt, slavery, or indentured servitude every 50 years, the next generation then would get an opportunity to get that land back and to be able to live in a maximal state of freedom. And that's what's so remarkable about the Torah. It's so pro-freedom, so much more pro-freedom than anything I've ever read from an economic perspective. And so for it to be like labeled with this sort of pro-slavery idea in a culture that is constantly enslaving its population through debt slavery that you can't escape even in bankruptcy. Like I find this to be such a frustrating framing because it's so dishonest, and Christians themselves don't understand how dishonest this framing is. So that's why I think it's critical for us to actually wade into this issue. It's really difficult to talk about ethical forms of biblical slavery because of that second part of the proposition that it instantly brings to mind that you're defending the transatlantic slave trade. And if you're being, if your race is being kidnapped by another race and enslaved, you have every right to do whatever you need to do to get out of that situation. That is so terribly unjust. There's nothing biblical about it. And anyone who's pointing to parts of the Bible to defend that and say, well, it says right here, masters, slaves obey your masters, is not talking about that situation. It's talking about these other situations, these prisoners of war. It could be that you voluntarily submitted to this. There's all kinds of situations in which you do need to be careful and get out of slavery through an ethical means because you were enslaved through an ethical means. But if you were kidnapped because of your race, there's nothing ethical about that. That is pure evil. That violence that's being inflicted on you, that was inflicted on you in the original scenario and continues to be inflicted on you, is totally unjustified in the perspective of the Bible. But that doesn't mean that you should remove from the possibility that somebody could go into debt and find themselves in a really tough situation, oftentimes by their own, unwise decisions, and then needs to work their way out of that debt somehow, or to cut off from people that want to enter into an indentured servitude scenario, like so many people did when they were trying to immigrate to the United States for the first time. These poor people had no money to afford the passage across the Atlantic from Europe, and so their decision, it wouldn't be more ethical to say, no, you and your family need to stay in this impossible situation in Europe, essentially in a low class, and I think very similar to slavery. Like, certainly that was practiced during the feudal times in Europe,
Yep.
in order to ensure that you're not allowed to sell your future labor as a means of getting across the Atlantic. That decision, or the ability for the Bible to allow for that kind of situation. I think again, it's nuanced and it's ethical. It's a good situation. You want to allow people the power to sell their future labor in order for them to get out of an impossible situation. You're not creating a more ethical society. Now, what people do, just like we do constantly, kind of culturally, is we stand from the posture of an incredibly wealthy nation, and then we look down on times in history where starvation was a real threat, and we judge them for the very difficult dilemmas that they were placed in, that dilemmas that we never really experience anymore in our day and age. And if we were to somehow like immediately go back to a time in which people were constantly starving to death, and this was a real threat, and you opened up some opportunities like indentured servitude, and you allowed for that, and under very specific conditions, and you created a very ethical and just system to protect those who are entering into that agreement. That's a good situation. Like, you'd want to allow that. That could save millions of people from starvation, and it did historically. But then, of course, we're opening ourselves up to this sort of rewriting and rereading of history. That's just very unfair.